But thank you all very much. This has been, this is our final session of what's been a really productive day in my view on the end of the Colorado legislative session here to reflect on, take stock, and discuss, even debate a little bit about where things are and where things are going. This last panel is on carbon markets, and I'm going to turn it over to Kristen in just a moment to introduce our facilitator. We'll introduce our panelists. Just to say a few things about the session and the larger event throughout the day has been really set up to foster discussions among scientists, decision makers, and Colorado constituents, and of course others who are also interested in Colorado issues and challenges. Really happy to have all of you joining us next year, perhaps in person at the end of the legislative session is our ambition, but in the meantime over Zoom. There's so much dynamism, such a wealth of knowledge in our state, such diversity across the state, that this Colorado Local Science Engagement Network is designed to help improve connectivity and coordination to catalyze productive and positive change across science, policy, technology, and society. And so in partnering with this event with the Institute for Science and Policy, it's just been a really great way for us to continue to do this work together. And so, you know, I'll say a few words at the end too, if I may, but I think at this point, I'll just turn it over to you, Kristen, to take it away.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, I just want to emphasize this has been a great partnership with you and your team and all of our other partners putting this on. It's been a great day of activities, and we're excited to continue this collaboration and build this momentum here in Colorado. And looking forward to today's discussion and really excited to end on this topic. I think it's a really fascinating, complex one, talking about carbon markets and carbon pricing, particularly through the lens of both Colorado as a state, but how that fits into both regional and national landscapes. So I don't want to spend much time talking. I want to introduce our moderator who will be leading us through today's discussion. It is my great pleasure to welcome Pamitha Weerasinghe. Pamitha is the Director for Government Relations and External Engagement with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, called UCAR. Also, my former organization before coming to the Institute. Had Pamitha joined many years ago, we would have worked together. Before coming to UCAR, Pamitha previously worked for the Union of Concerned Scientists on transportation and defense of science issues. He also worked for 7 years on the staff of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, mostly as a professional staffer on the Environment Subcommittee. Pamitha has earned his law degree from the University of Pittsburgh, and he does undergraduate studies in Maryland. So thank you for joining us today, Pamitha. Let me pass this over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. That was a kind introduction. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm really looking forward to a spirited discussion. For those of you who may not know, the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, or UCAR, is a nonprofit consortium of more than 120 North American colleges and universities focused on research and training in the Earth system sciences. Most notably, we manage the National Center for Atmospheric Research on behalf of the National Science Foundation, a role that we've held since 1960, and have been bringing together the Earth system science community to exchange ideas, discuss challenges, and share solutions ever since. But enough about me. We are here to discuss carbon pricing, and I'm pleased to say that we have a great panel to conclude today's event. Mark Hafstead is a fellow and director of resources for the future. He joined RFF in 2013 from Stanford University. His research focuses on the evaluation and design of climate and energy policies. With Stanford professor and RFF University fellow Lawrence H. Goulder, he wrote Confronting the Climate Challenge, U.S. Policy Options, published at Columbia University Press, to evaluate the environmental and economic impacts of carbon taxes, cap and trade programs, clean energy standards, and gasoline taxes using a sophisticated multi-sector model of the United States. His research also analyzes the distributional and employment impacts of carbon pricing and the design of tax adjustment mechanisms to reduce the emissions uncertainty of carbon tax policies. We also have Patrick Cummins, who is a senior policy advisor at the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, where he leads the center's work with Western states, utilities, and stakeholders on the transition to a low carbon economy. Patrick has been working with Western states and stakeholders on air quality and climate programs for 35 years, including at the Regional Air Quality Council in Metro Denver, and as the Director of Air Quality and Climate Programs at the Western Governors Association. Patrick has a chemistry degree from Fort Lewis College in his hometown of Durango, Colorado, and a master's degree in environmental policy from Indiana University. Go Hoosiers. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark for some opening remarks. Mark?
All right, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as long as everyone can acknowledge they can see my slides, I'll get started. Great. So I'm going to sort of talk about carbon pricing and carbon markets in Colorado and kick it off. So before we get there, I just want to say that Resource for the Future, where I work, we are an independent nonprofit institution based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement. Most importantly, we do not take institutional positions on any public policy matters, whether that be legislative, regulatory, or judicial. And so anything I say here today, the opinions are my own. I also just say that I did live in Colorado for a brief moment back after I graduated undergrad, working at Beaver Creek Ski Resort for winter, and it was a great time. And my brother has now lived there for the last 11 years. So Colorado, I think, is what I like to think of as a second home. So why are we talking about carbon pricing and carbon markets in Colorado? So here I did a report on Colorado's Decarbonizing Colorado last year, and these are just a couple graphics from that report. So Colorado has very aggressive emissions targets for 2025 and 2030, yet it is not projected to meet those emissions targets with current policy. So new policy is needed. So what could that new policy look like? So as the title of this session is carbon pricing and carbon markets, there's a few different options and we can think about. So there's a carbon tax, which has been used in British Columbia back in 2008. It's one of the first jurisdictions to introduce a carbon tax. There's also cap and trade programs. So cap and trade programs are like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which covers the power sector emissions from Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. There's the Western Climate Initiative, which is a consortium of California and Quebec to limit emissions in those two jurisdictions. And then maybe the biggest carbon market through a cap and trade program is the European Union's emissions trading scheme, which covers about 42% of emissions in the European Union. Beyond carbon, so those are both examples of carbon pricing. So beyond carbon pricing, we can think of other ways to put a market for carbon. So some of the ways we can think about that are compliance programs through programs that are not actually carbon pricing programs. So one example is the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is a policy that's been adopted in California, Oregon, and coming up in Washington State. And that's a program that gives that basically requires producers of fuels to pay a price if the carbon content of their fuels exceeds a certain amount, and then it gives credits to, or then those credits are then sold to suppliers who succeed the requirement. And so this is the way it does put a price on carbon, but it does through in a very different way. Also, zero emissions vehicle standards are another way to quote unquote put a price on carbon through markets. And controversially, although factually, Tesla is profitable because of zero emissions vehicle standards. And so what happens is that Tesla receives credits for producing their EV vehicles. They sell them to big manufacturers like Ford and GM and Toyota, who have not met these standards. And then Tesla is actually, that's the way they are actually profitable these days. And then the last way we can think about carbon markets are through voluntary offset markets. And so two very recent examples of these voluntary offset markets are that a card payment service called Stripe and Microsoft have invested in direct air capture facilities. And so they are basically paying to remove carbon from the air so that they can become net zero in their own emissions. So I'm going to talk mostly about carbon pricing instead of carbon markets, and I think Patrick will come back to maybe at least low carbon fuel standard. So a carbon tax, just to be clear, is a tax based on the carbon content of fuels. And because CO2 emissions are proportional to carbon content, so basically if we place a, say, 1 cent tax on gasoline, that's equivalent to a $1 carbon tax. So a $1 carbon tax is equivalent to a 1 cent tax on gasoline. Obviously, for fuels that are more have higher carbon content, the price increase would be more. Cap and trade programs, where the government basically creates the right to emit 1 ton of CO2. And through the sales and purchases of those allowances, it yields a market price for a ton of carbon dioxide emissions. I'd also mention that under cap and trade programs, that it's very easy to think about banking. So that's the idea where you can buy allowances today and use them in the future. It's very easy to think about offsets, where emissions reductions come from unregulated sectors, and also program linking, where perhaps you could link a cap and trade program between 2 different jurisdictions. And so the Quebec and California coalition is a perfect example of that. So just to be clear on carbon pricing, and something I know Patrick and I have talked about a little bit about, so a carbon tax provides price certainty. So people know what the price is going to be going forward, but a cap and trade program provides quantity certainty. So it provides a kind of a legally binding limit on the amount of emissions that could occur. And so those in theory, those 2 things are very different, although in practice, we actually think that these things could actually be more similar. And so, for example, under cap and trade programs, there have been put in place both price floors and price ceilings to restrict price volatility. And so, for example, under the California program, there's a price floor that in each auction, the price cannot go below that certain level. And then if the price goes high, then they actually release more allowances to help reduce the price. Under a carbon tax, a lot of research I've done has shown that you can introduce these tax adjustment mechanisms to automatically adjust the rates without congressional approval or without legislative approval if emissions don't meet projections. And so this is another way of basically making a carbon tax and a cap and trade program look more similar. So I'm an economist, and so I always like to make the economic case for carbon pricing. So why do economists like carbon pricing? The first reason we like carbon pricing is because it's flexible. It allows the market to determine when, where, and how emissions are reduced. And so emissions can reduce through a variety of ways. So it can be reduced through lower emissions intensity, say through fuel switching between coal and gas generating electricity units. It could be done through switching fuels from, say, gasoline to low carbon fuels. It could also incentivize reductions in total energy use, so driving less or using electricity less. And it also incentivizes capture and storage. And so which are, a nascent technology, but something that could potentially be used particularly towards 2050. The other thing about carbon pricing is that It doesn't equalize reductions across sectors, it equalizes incentives. So this means that the cost of reducing a ton of CO2, which is a global greenhouse gas, which is global greenhouse gas, it means you make the reductions where they're low cost rather than where they're high cost. Whereas regulations that demand demand reductions in a certain sector, maybe that's not the case for that is economic. And so the carbon pricing automatically just gives you the incentive to reduce in low cost sectors, but not in the high cost sectors. Carbon pricing also encourages innovation across the energy sector. So whether that's in the power sector or the transportation sector or building sectors, but also including negative emissions technologies. So negative emissions technologies include carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, afforestation or reforestation. These are all things that can help take emissions out of the take carbon that's already in the air out of it. And so that's an it's an incentive that you don't often see in other policies. And most importantly, a carbon price creates revenues by charging people for the amount of carbon dioxide they put in the air. It creates revenues. These revenues can be large, and these revenues can be used for a variety of reasons. These revenues can be used to offset the increase in energy prices for low-income households. It could be used to invest in environmental justice communities. It could be used to invest in further reducing emissions through investing in energy efficiency programs or something like that. So there's a lot of ways the revenues can be used. So what are the impacts of carbon pricing? So I kind of went into like why we want to think about carbon pricing, but like how is it effective? So so research has shown that a moderate carbon price can produce meaningful reductions both immediately and over time in a variety of sectors. Now, the power sector is certainly the most responsive sector to carbon pricing, and the transportation sector is generally thought of as the least responsive. So again, I said that a $1 carbon price is equivalent to about a 1-cent increase in the price of gasoline. So a $50 carbon price is equal to a 50-cent increase in the price of gasoline. And we've certainly seen the price of gasoline be changed within the $2 range and even in the last 2 years. So we haven't seen big changes in gasoline use over the last 2 years in those big changes in gasoline pricing. So we don't expect that carbon pricing will have a huge impact in transportation, certainly in the short run, before people have the opportunity to potentially invest in new vehicles. On the economy, we think that at most there's a small reduction in GDP growth over time. When you think about jobs as being based in DC, most people a lot of people like to ask me about what's the job impact. We think that the job loss overall is small, but we do think that there's going to be reallocation of labor across sectors, which means that some industries are going to create jobs and some industries are going to lose jobs. And then how you use the revenues, I said there's a lot of ways you can use the revenue as an important determinant of overall costs and the distribution of those costs. And so as I mentioned, we can offset certain negative impacts on certain households or industries through strategic revenue use. So for example, using the revenues to do a dividend can make sure that somewhere between 40 and 70% of the lowest income households actually come out ahead. So that means that actually that the dividend they get is actually higher than the increase in their energy costs. So in Colorado, what are the impacts of carbon pricing in Colorado? So it's a Colorado event. So I highly encourage everyone to read this report I wrote last year called Decarbonizing Colorado, Evaluating Cap and Trade Programs to Meet Colorado's Emissions Targets. And so what we showed is that, as I showed on the first graph, is that Colorado is not on track to meet its strict emissions targets, and so the state is going to need new policies. And so this report laid out a pathway that could be used to reach these targets through flexible cap and trade policies. And so just very quickly to finish up here, as I mentioned, the electric power sector is certainly the most In Colorado, we expect to be the most responsive sector to carbon pricing, even very low carbon prices. We expect significant decarbonization in the power sector. So this is through the closure of coal plants earlier than their planned retirements, and through switching, and also not just switching to natural gas, but actually switching to renewables. Whereas transportation and commercial, we expect to be much less responsive. So being at very high price levels, we expect much less reductions. But that's not to say that we shouldn't necessarily put a price on those sectors. Every ton of CO2 we can remove is towards the better. So I won't go through this too much, but here in the report, we evaluated a Colorado-only program and a Western Climate Initiative linked program. So the allowance price is much higher in 2025 or 2030 in the Colorado-only program, where Colorado tries to achieve its emissions reductions through its own program. But if it links through a program to Quebec and California, then emissions allowance prices could be much lower, and the GDP impacts could also be much lower. I also just want to briefly mention that reducing carbon dioxide also means reducing local pollution that's caused by fossil fuel combustion. So like sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, and fine particulate matter. And there are significant health benefits from reducing those emissions. And we estimate that the benefits of reducing local pollution benefits can actually be greater than the so-called climate benefits. So the climate benefits here I've estimated by multiplying the emissions reductions by the carbon dioxide emissions reductions by the social cost of carbon, which is also a very controversial number. So we've used a kind of a mid-range number there, but local pollution benefits of reducing combustion of fossil fuels can maybe even be better than the impacts of reducing at the local level from reducing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so I just want to finish on what are the political realities of carbon pricing. So at the federal level, we have 5 carbon taxes introduced in Congress. And we know we have a very split Congress right now with a 50-50 Democrat-Republican mix in the Senate. And so reconciliation is an option is what the Democrats are trying to use to pass a number of legislative priorities. But I'll just note that a carbon tax of all the policies that the government could pursue is probably the one that's most easily fit within reconciliation. And so reconciliation is for those who aren't familiar, is where you only need a 51 vote majority. So if 50 Democrats signed on to it, then Kamala Harris would be the tie-breaking vote. But reconciliation has has some rules that the Senate parliamentarian uses to determine what is and what cannot be passed through reconciliation. So for example, the Senate parliamentarian ruled earlier this year that a increase in the federal minimum wage could not pass through reconciliation. But a carbon tax is very easy because it's a budgetary measure. A cap and trade program, on the other hand, would be much harder to get through reconciliation. However, there are a few buts here, obviously, and one is that Democrats are actually exceedingly moving away from carbon pricing as a federal climate policy. And one of the reasons they're doing this is that environmental justice communities have a strong aversion to market-based policies. They're very fearful that a market-based policy will reduce emissions in affluent areas, increase emissions, especially local air pollutant emissions, in non-affluent areas. And so this is a big concern within environmental justice communities. It's not necessarily a concern that's been borne out in the data. There has been some conflicting information out of California on what California's cap and trade program has done, but I think the best research has shown that this concern has not happened, but it's still a concern that needs to be addressed. And then the other political reality of carbon pricing, there's only one current Republican congressman who has co-sponsored a price on carbon. And so until, if we think that reconciliation is not going to be the pathway to pass a carbon tax, you're going to need about 10 or 11 Republican senators, and not a single Republican senator has yet to endorse a carbon price. On the Colorado level, I'm going to leave most of this to Patrick, but there is the reality of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights in terms of how you could do a increase on carbon tax in Colorado. I've heard that there are some local measures attempting to put some carbon pricing in local municipalities. Whether or not those can actually be effective and efficient at reducing emissions, that's unlikely. And the reason is because, this is the global pollutant, and local municipalities only have so much jurisdiction over where they can actually put the price on carbon and what incentives they can put to actually reduce those emissions. So having lived in Washington, D.C., tried to pass a carbon pricing bill that basically would have been a increase in the gas tax. Washington, D.C. is a very small municipality. People could easily go to Maryland or Virginia to buy their gasoline at much lower prices if that occurred. And then I think as Patrick could probably talk about, Governor Polis has not come out in support of cap and trade programs or carbon pricing generally, and has tended to support a much more regulatory type of framework. So it seems unlikely that carbon pricing will be implemented in Colorado or even at the federal level in the near term, although we always have political surprises. And so, but I'm still happy to talk and take any questions on what could happen. And so with that, I want to say thank you. And we have a lot of really valuable information on rff.org. In particular, we introduced this really cool carbon pricing video in the last couple of weeks that I recommend everyone check out. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I know that I had a lot of questions buzzing around as you were talking. It was incredibly informative. And I want to encourage everybody who is participating today to feel free and ask your questions in the chat. We are monitoring the chat closely. And so when we get to the Q&A section, we can ask your questions as well. With that, Patrick, I'll turn it over to you. Patrick.
Thank you, Pamitha, and everyone who has helped put this on. And thank you, Mark, for a great overview presentation on the subject. I think I agree with basically everything Mark just said. So I will try not to repeat too much and maybe just drill down on a few points that may be relevant and of interest here. So the first thing I want to clarify is that despite the fact that I am employed at an energy policy think tank at a university, I am neither an academic nor a scholar. I am a practitioner and someone who has worked with state governments for a long time to develop air pollution control programs. And so when we talk about carbon pricing as a way to reduce emissions, we are essentially talking about carbon pricing as an air pollution control program. That's the way I think about it. And so that's kind of how I come at these issues and these questions. The part of my bio that got edited out is probably the most relevant to this conversation, which is that for 8 years, I worked as the executive director of the Western Climate Initiative, which is the program that Mark referred to in his presentation. It is the world's first and still only economy-wide cap and trade program for greenhouse gas emissions. And that has been implemented since 2013 by the state of California and the province of Quebec as a linked program, which means that allowances that are issued by one jurisdiction are eligible, can be used for regulated sources in the other jurisdiction to demonstrate compliance. There were a number of Western states, 7 specifically, that were part of the Western Climate Initiative, along with 4 Canadian provinces. But California and Quebec were the only 2 to actually get the program across the finish line. Colorado was not a member of the Western Climate Initiative. Ontario actually implemented it for a very brief period of time. And then there was an election, and the new premier there rolled the program back. But just in the last month or so, the state of Washington, which was one of the original participants in the Western Climate Initiative, passed legislation to implement an economy-wide cap and trade program, presumably to join the Western Climate Initiative, or at least give serious consideration to that, as opposed to going it alone. And we saw in Mark's presentation that the bigger the market, the more participants, the more efficient and lower cost implementation you can achieve. So that was very exciting for me. I started working on the Western Climate Initiative 14 years ago. Washington was at the table for that. It only took them 14 years to get the legislation to implement it. And that certainly does speak to some of the political challenges of these programs. Washington State also had 2 failed ballot measures to institute a carbon tax prior to successfully passing the cap and trade legislation. And then the example in Ontario where the government changed and they were pulled out. So there's no doubt that developing and implementing these types of programs is very challenging. I would observe that the issue is not that really the benefits or the efficiency or efficacy of these programs. The issue is really that these are the types of things that jurisdictions implement when they are really serious about driving down emissions and hitting emissions targets. And that's a big political lift, and it is one that we struggle with in this country at the national level, and so it's not surprising. One of the key benefits of these programs, many of them, is that they provide a source of revenue for investment and infrastructure, and that is a key aspect of them, especially for state governments that cannot print money. The federal government, not so much. They can print money. So we have obviously some big proposals on the table now for massive investment in infrastructure and incentives for clean energy that at the federal level, and those are very important. But here's the thing, from my perspective, is that when you start thinking about the kinds of emission reductions that we need to achieve on what time scale, any suite of programs, because it's going to be a lot of different things, but it's got to include enforceable limits on carbon pollution or emission standards. And that's really the key difference between something like a carbon tax and a cap and trade program. Mark described that. I, as someone who has worked on implementation of the Clean Air Act and on cap and trade, I have a very strong bias for policies that put enforceable limits on carbon pollution. And I think that especially when we start looking at targets like a 50% reduction by 2030, it's absolutely necessary. We're not just going to get there through incentives and infrastructure. And there's a lot of different ways that those can be done. And again, I'm not saying that's a silver bullet, because it's going to take a whole suite of policies to achieve rapid and deep decarbonization. The one thing that is important to point out about both the carbon tax and cap and trade is that what the jurisdiction does with the revenue is a policy choice. Okay, so British Columbia has a carbon tax, but their carbon tax is a revenue neutral carbon tax. So Mark was describing one of the benefits as it creates revenue that can then be invested. And that's a huge benefit of the program. But in British Columbia, where they have a moderate carbon price, they also, which as Mark said, mainly impacts the electric power sector, and British Columbia is all hydro, so it doesn't, there's not an issue there. So British Columbia has a low carbon price, and it's revenue neutral. And as a result, there's been an increase in emissions in British Columbia over the last dozen years or so that they've had a carbon price. California, let's take that example for cap and trade. The cap and trade program, which a lot of people are starting to call cap and invest. And I'm sort of, I get a little, I wonder sometimes when we start changing names of things because we think maybe then people will like it better. Like we don't want to say global warming anymore. We say climate change. There's reasons for that too. But nevertheless, a lot of people are starting to call cap and trade cap and invest. And that really is, I think, a better description, not just a marketing name change. The cap and invest or cap and trade program in California over the last 8 years since its inception has generated about $26 billion of revenue to the state, which it is investing back into to the clean energy transition. In the last year alone, it's brought in about $4 billion. And that is, some of that money goes through the electric utilities. Hang on, I gotta get some water. So anyway, I think those are some important distinctions to keep in mind when you think about the policy design. As far as Colorado is concerned, the the other thing that was not mentioned, but I think many of you may know, is that the director of our center at Colorado State University, the Center for the New Energy Economy, is our former governor, Bill Ritter. And Governor Ritter is still our director, and I'm very fortunate to work for him. A lot of the clean energy work in Colorado started under his administration 15 or so years ago with expansion of the RPS and things like that. And Colorado has really made great strides in renewable energy as a result of that. And that work has continued under subsequent governors, and we've continued to make progress, especially in the electric power sector. And over the last couple of years, we've just catapulted forward, first as a result of commitments by electric utilities in Colorado, who came forward with big carbon reduction commitments. In December of 2019, Xcel announced their, I'm just making sure it was 2019. No, it was December of, Governor Polis was elected in 2018, right? Okay, so it was in 2018, just after Governor Polis's election, that Xcel Energy announced their big carbon reduction commitment, including an 80% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And that kind of blew the top off this issue in the electric industry nationally. We worked with Tri-State to develop their responsible energy plan, and now we just had legislation in Colorado to institute enforceable limits on carbon dioxide from the electric power sector across the board. So when we think about a carbon tax or cap and trade in Colorado, we have to acknowledge that one of the major sectors, the electric power sector, has already been sort of well covered, if you will, by the commitments from the utilities and now the legislation. And so a low carbon tax, which primarily potential to reduce emissions from the electric power sector, is probably not necessary in a sense to help decarbonize the electric power sector in Colorado. It could still be an important source of revenue for the state, though. But a higher carbon tax, and Mark was showing numbers up to $200 a ton to get something like 30%. I just was kind of eyeballing his chart to get like 30% by 2030. And Mark, and tell me if I'm off there, but if you think about that from a national perspective and take the power sector out, that's $1 trillion a year of about 5 billion tons, $200 a ton nationally, and to get a 30% reduction. So I think that the point I'm trying to make is just that high carbon tax is, and to use a very high carbon tax like $200 a ton, which would be $2 a gallon, as a way to drive down emissions, I think is a very, very hard sell. And we do not have any jurisdiction, state or federal, in the United States that has implemented a carbon tax, and yet we have multiple examples of states and provinces, but it's states implementing cap and invest programs with RGGI, with the Western Climate Initiative, the Transportation Climate Initiative in the Northeast that they're trying to get off the ground. And states are joining this. I mentioned Washington had joined or had passed legislation for cap and trade. We'll see if they join WCI. Virginia recently joined RGGI, the Northeast program. And I'm going to stop in 3 minutes here, don't worry. And then we see there are efforts in both Pennsylvania and North Carolina to join RGGI, although those are efforts that are meeting pretty significant resistance in those states. So, probably the last thing to say then about Colorado. And if you followed Senate Bill 200, you saw that there was a big disagreement between the legislature and the executive branch about what kind of policies to implement. And there was a compromise reached and new limits placed on the electric power sector and oil and gas, and some other very helpful policies for other sectors. But still, we know that in a growing state like Colorado, transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural emissions are all very, very hard to drive emissions down. Colorado's not unique in that respect. It's a national and international problem. And so I think Mark's right that we do need additional policies, and that carbon pricing, whether or whether it's cap and invest or a low carbon fuel standard for the transportation sector, or some kind of carbon tax that would send the price signal and create a revenue stream, those are all potential policies for Colorado still, even though a lot of policy is already in place and coming. But the thing is that in Colorado, you're going to have to go to the ballot. It's, I don't think there is and there are people who might make a case for doing, some workaround, but I think if it's going to be a cap and invest program where the state is going to sell allowances, or whether clearly if it's a carbon tax program, it's under our state law, Tabor, it's going to have to go to a vote. There is going to have to be a ballot measure either through petition or referred by the state legislature. And quite frankly, I don't think people should spend too much time. If there are people who are interested in that in Colorado and want to push that, I don't think they should waste too much time trying to think about how to avoid a ballot measure. I think they ought to sort of lean into that and just be realistic that that's what it's going to take. And I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that to the extent that a policy like carbon pricing, either cap and trade, cap and invest, or tax is going to get in place in Colorado, it is going to have to, I believe, go through the ballot. A low carbon fuel standard, and now I really will stop, but a low carbon fuel standard is a particularly interesting policy in my opinion, because it places an enforceable limit on emissions from the transportation sector. But the credits that are issued by the state in recognition of clean fuels provided, the dollars flow from the clean fuel provider or from the petroleum fuel providers to the clean fuel providers. So if you're creating biodiesel, sell it in Colorado, you get a credit from the state. You then sell that credit to the petroleum fuel provider, because they're the ones that have to demonstrate to the state that they have reduced the carbon intensity of their fuel. And so they need those credits, and they buy them, and no dollars flow through state government. And so that is one where it potentially could be adopted through a regulation. Maybe there's probably a good case that the State Air Commission already has the authority to implement such a program. And that program, by the way, has been implemented in California, Oregon, and British Columbia, and that is another policy that was just adopted by the Washington State Legislature. I can think of all kinds of other things to say, but I'm going to stop there and see if we have some questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. This really has been a great discussion, and there have been a couple questions that have come in from the chat, and so we'll use that as a starting off point. Particularly to, I think what you would, we'll go one point prior to what you were saying, Patrick, and this is sort of tied into a question for Mark, which is, there are many sectors in Colorado that can apply for carbon pricing or will be impacted by carbon pricing, as you showed, Mark, in your chart. Do you have a suggested ballpark for each sector and an estimate in the state of Colorado that would be effective to achieve reductions? And then what exactly makes a sector more or less responsive to carbon pricing? And how do you assess and predict that kind of responsiveness?
So the way we use models to try to assess the type of fuel switching that's possible. And so in the power sector, we've seen a huge amount of fuel switching from coal to natural gas over the last 10 to 15 years, caused by the shale revolution and the fall of natural gas prices. So we know that the power sector is really responsive to pricing, and we've seen it. We don't need to predict it. We have seen that the transportation sector is much less responsive to pricing. We see world oil prices fluctuate from $2 a gallon to $4 a gallon and back down and then back up. And we see some changes in fuel demands from high prices. Notably, you see like an increase in fuel efficient, like Prius type vehicle purchases during high gas price areas. You see more purchases of like F-150s during low gas price eras. With that, so we don't historically see like changes in emissions given changes in prices in the transportation sector. And so there, and the other thing about, and then so the one thing I'll caveat that with is in Canada, when they have implemented changes in gas prices through taxes, we've actually seen a 3 times increase in the change in fuel demand caused by a change in a 1 cent change in gas taxes versus a 1 cent change in gas prices. So it seems that consumers are actually more responsive to changes in gas taxes than gas prices. And maybe that's because they think that gas taxes are more permanent than gas prices. But so the way we see like where we think sectors are responsive to carbon pricing is just where we've seen responses from just fuel price changes in the past. The other thing I'll say is just like when you have fuel switching capability, that's when carbon pricing is really simple. So when you can switch from coal to gas or coal to solar or wind to produce electricity, that's simple. But in the transportation sector, yeah, you have the blend wall problem where you can't increase the amount of ethanol you put into vehicles without causing problems to most engines. In industrial sector, there's a lot of sectors that is very hard for them to switch fuels. So maybe they could switch to hydrogen, but that might be 20 years off. So if you have a opportunity to switch fuels, those are the sectors that are going to be most responsive to pricing.
Thanks, Mark. Patrick, do you have any comments?
No, thank you.
So let's get political. Also from the chat, why do you think the revenue neutrality element of some carbon taxing policies, like in British Columbia and suggested in some of the United States, have become partisan?
Well, it seems like everything's partisan on this issue, so I'm not sure that the revenue neutrality is partisan. I will just say, and Mark probably has more and better things to say, but you know, the Citizens Climate Lobby, for example, is a proposal for a revenue neutral carbon tax, and I don't think that is a conservative proposal. And we have bipartisan proposals, and I think Mark's done some work on those that, you know, are revenue neutral. So I don't think that the idea of a revenue neutral carbon tax is a partisan policy, because that is a policy design option, and I don't see that as partisan in the examples that are being pushed. You know, but what the idea there is that you continue to increase the price until you get the emission response, but the government doesn't hold on to that money. It refunds it in, you know, one way or another, and especially to protect low-income households. But so there's, in my mind, on paper, there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't provide you with the revenue source for investment and incentives and infrastructure, you know, and that's a downside, I think. But it trades out. There's the trade-off there is that it just says, but we're just going to keep raising the price until we get the emission response. And so it's really more of a policy design question, I think, than a partisan political question. But Mark, I'm interested what you think about that.
So I'm thinking about what happened in Washington State in 2016 and 2018. So 2016, Washington proposed had the ballot initiative for a carbon tax where all the revenues were used to, it was a revenue tax where the revenues were used to reduce sales taxes and some corporate taxes. And that policy was attacked by Greens. Notably, the Sierra Club came very much out against it. Van Jones, who was the Green czar of the Obama administration, came out against it, and it failed. And in 2018, they tried again, and they tried to do a carbon tax. We use all the revenues to invest. It also failed. And so the attacks were different, obviously, in each case. The attacks from the progressive side were much less on the 2018 ballot initiative. So you didn't see that as much. But in the 2018 ballot initiative, you saw a lot of attacks from the right that was basically saying they're going to take all this money and they're going to give it to an 18-person, committee who's going to decide how to spend this money, and we have no idea how they're going to spend it. And so, so I think, yeah, as Patrick said, I think the revenue use is a policy choice, and I think there's there's a lot of reasons why people think that a revenue neutral policy may be more may be more likely to be supported by Republicans, but we haven't seen Republicans support any type of policy, really. We've seen only very few. We've seen Jeff Flake, before he left the Senate, supported the carbon dividend when he was a lame duck senator. We've seen Representative Rooney from Florida support a variety of carbon prices. We've seen Representative Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania support a gas tax repeal and combined with the carbon tax. But beyond that, we haven't seen a lot of Republicans support it. So I think theoretically, people like to think that a revenue neutral policy would entice Republicans to sign on for this type of policy, but we just haven't seen it in the past.
That touches on a really interesting concept of, particularly you mentioned Jeff Flake, who didn't support something like this until he was on his way out of office. And it speaks to the responsiveness that elected officials have to their constituency. I think one of the comments that was brought up in the presentations earlier was the idea that this needs to be done at the ballot here in Colorado. And so I guess my question is, and this ties on to a question in the chat, is how in Colorado do we reach consensus on this issue? What is the argument that may not have yet been made that can get us to that point? And then from the chat, specifically in the agriculture sector, are there opportunities there to engage the ag sector in a carbon pricing program? What challenges exist there? And Patrick, specifically to you, what are the politics within the context of Colorado, and how important is it to get buy-in from the ag sector?
Well, let me just say about the ag sector. So the main emission sources from the ag sector are from livestock methane emissions and from fertilizer and nitrous oxide emissions. Those are the two big hitters in the ag sector. Yes, the ag sector uses fuel and tractors and machinery and things like that. So those are kind of non-road transportation sources that could be sort of encompassed in a transportation fuels policy. But on the other parts, so typically they are exempted, and I think there are specific exemptions in Colorado law for agriculture, certain agricultural sources, and they are not covered by the cap and trade program in California, partly because they are very hard to quantify, to measure. You have to be able to have monitoring, measurement, reporting, verification of emissions. If you're going to be trading tons, so to speak, you have to have a high confidence. And there's estimates about how much nitrous oxide comes off a hayfield when you apply a fertilizer, but it's not highly quantified. But the way that the ag sector, so in that sense, I think the ag sector is likely to be exempt from most of this, and so I think that's how you get their buy-in for the most part, and that that's, in my opinion, mostly appropriate, in that we don't really have good solutions to some of those emission sources. But the other way, there's actually a big upside for the ag sector, I should say, and that is that they can participate in offsets programs. So they can get paid for taking actions to reduce emissions. And so, for example, manure management and digesters at dairy plants that prevent methane from going into the air, captures that methane, puts it in a pipeline. There are agricultural facilities that benefit from these programs, and there are credits like that, some of the most lucrative credits like that under the low carbon fuel standard program as well, because you're preventing methane, which has a much higher greenhouse gas potential. Now I know that Max is going to keep us on time here. So I'm sure we're at the end of our time. I just want to make sure that anybody who has questions or wants to reach out to me, you can find me through the Center for the New Energy Economy website at Colorado State University. And there was just one point I wanted to make that I didn't sneak in yet, and that relates back to the California Cap and Trade program. And you'll see there's a lot of commentary about the effectiveness of that program up to this point. But it's important to recognize that from 2013 through 2020, last year, 6 months ago, that was the first phase of the program, and the cap was 1990 levels by 2020. It was a very modest cap. Emissions did not have to come down very much at all to meet that cap. But in 2017, the state legislature, by a supermajority vote, thereby inoculating the program against future lawsuits, established 40% below 1990 levels, which is essentially 40% below current levels by 2030. So the trajectory of the cap, goes from a fairly flat, modest decrease up through last year to a much steeper decrease to get to a 40% reduction by the end of this decade. So for all there's a lot of negative, a lot of negative commentary about that program that wounds me, and so I just want to put in a word of defense here. Don't reach judgments too quickly until we see how it performs this decade, because I do believe that it's the kind of program that you get it in place, you refine it, you ratchet it down, and you keep tweaking it so that you can have an orderly transition away from fossil fuels, which is what we need to do.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for that closing comment. It's always that Columbo question at the end that really hits home. Well, I do know that we are a little bit over time, and while we have additional questions that have both come in from chat and that are in the queue, I think we should wrap it up. I want to thank both of our panelists. And Max, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pamitha, and thank you very much, Mark and Patrick. It was a great panel discussion. So with the end of this session, this concludes our legislative event today. Thanks to all of you who have been joining us via Zoom throughout the day. If you've missed any of our sessions, you can get them at our website. We're going to post them up shortly. And YouTube channel, Presley's about to drop, if she just did drop the links in the chat. You can also follow us on Twitter, and then we'll post up an announcement when they go up. I want to just say a special thanks to our special projects directors, David Onk and Michaela Blanton, who through their hard work and the hard work of communication directors, Presley Church and Kayla Zacharias here in the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network team, have made this possible today. I also thank Matt Druckenmiller, who co-leads the project with me. And I thank Linda Pendergrass, David Zakovic, and Katie Human in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, or series, that have provided institutional support today. And again, as I've said, and I can't say too much, just really want to thank Kristen Eulenbrock for her partnership in this through the Institute for Science and Policy in Denver, and the rest of her team for their hard work to make this day possible. And so, as I mentioned at the start, this is a project that's based at the University of Colorado Boulder with through the partnership and funding support of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We had many collaborators and co-sponsors for today: the Institute for Science and Policy that I mentioned, Ceres mentioned, Western Water Assessment, the Colorado Climate Center, the Center for Creative Communication and Behavior Change, CoLabs, and then AAAS, Local Science Engagement Network in DC. And there's been representation across all the panels today from leaders at each of those groups and centers and institutes. So thank you very much for all of your contributions today. We're excited to continue these conversations going forward, connecting scientists to policymakers and to Colorado constituents. And so we really focused in on the 3 priority areas that we've established through this project. First being technology. We focused today on rural broadband. Second, climate and environment. We talked about climate information for decision making. And then third, decarbonization, where we've been taking up these considerations of carbon markets, carbon taxes, and so on. And so I hope you found this all worthwhile yourselves. There's much more work to be done here, so let's keep this going. And thank you all for staying on a few minutes past our allotted time. Again, hearty thanks to Mark, Patrick, Pamitha, and the rest of all the folks here who've made today's events possible.